Welcome to the New Thinking for a New World podcast, where we explore the most pressing issues that are challenging and changing our societies. We are looking for new thinking and new solutions wherever we can find them. Listen as host Alan Stoga, the Talberg Foundation's chairman, challenges his guests for analysis, ideas and actions. Together, we can help make our world at least a bit better.
India looks to be on a roll. The country has now surpassed China as the world's most populous nation. India's geopolitical importance is recognized by its current presidency of the G20, which means Prime Minister Modi will host the annual Global Leaders Summit in September. Modi's BJP, in power since 2014, is widely expected to win next year's general election, not the least because the Indian economy is growing at a 6% clip, far and away the fastest growth among major countries. And despite the government's nationalist agenda and the country's legendary bureaucracy, India is attracting international investors, both because of its perceived dynamism and because foreign investment in its great rival, China, is looking a bit dicey. Is India the new China? Or maybe an alternative to China for the rest of the global South as well as the West? And is India's continuing rise inevitable? Answers to those questions turn on whether India can leverage all those people, their evident entrepreneurial and business capacities, modern technology, and more political stability than the country has seen in a long time into sustained prosperity. Or will underlying centrifugal forces of religion, inequality, and nationalism define India's next chapter? My guest today spends much of his time trying to parse the answers. Milan Vaishnav is a senior fellow and director of the South Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington. He understands India from inside and from outside, which gives him the advantage of both sides now. Welcome, Dr. Vaishnav.
Thank you so much for having me.
I know you focus on India's political economy, on the nitty-gritty of how India actually works. But let me start with the 60,000-foot question. India is both a rich and a poor country, a $3 trillion economy where the per capita income is something like $2,400, and only a bit more than a quarter of the households earn more than $10,000 per year. How does India cope with those extremes?
You know, India in some ways is more analogous to the European Union than it is to the United States. When you think about the diversity, not just in terms of per capita income, but in terms of language, in terms of culture, in terms of kind of local traditions, we forget, for instance, that India's most populous state, the state of Uttar Pradesh, has upwards of 230 million people, right? It would be the fifth largest country in the world if it were its own country. And you're quite right that it is a confederation of extremes. You know, the three richest states in the Indian Union are 3 times richer than the 3 poorest states. I think the way that this has gotten ironed out is through a couple of mechanisms. One is democracy, right? There is a pretty deep-seated commitment to finding peaceful ways of resolving disputes. You know, India is wasn't only the poorest country ever to adopt universal suffrage. It's also the longest-standing democracy in the developing world. I think it's important for your listeners to remember that. The second is that, there is a very elaborate system of compensatory transfers that take place from the central government to the states. The states do the vast majority of the spending, but the center is the one that collects the vast majority of the taxes, right? So there's very intricate formulas that allow for that decentralization process to take place. And I think the third part of the answer is under the Constitution, states are quite have a lot of agency, right? This is a robustly federal country. It does have some centralizing tendencies we can talk about, but on most aspects of day-to-day governance, people look to their state capitals and to their chief minister the equivalent of governors in the United States, not necessarily to the prime minister or to the elected parliament.
Let's talk about both economics and then politics, and particularly democracy. As measured by GDP per capita, India and China were almost exactly the same in 1995. Fast forward to 2023, China's GDP per capita is something like 5 times greater than India's. Now, we could talk for hours about what happened between then and now, and we don't have hours. So let me ask a different question. Is India now doing what it takes to accelerate on a sustained basis domestic growth and development?
So I think there's a half full and half empty answer to this. And let me give you both. I think on the half full side, under this government, over the past 10 years or so, India has seriously upgraded its investments in what people like to call the hardware of the economy, right? So there's been a digital payments revolution. 1.3 billion Indians have a unique biometric identification number. You have new laws on that streamline indirect taxes. You have a new law that creates the possibility of corporate bankruptcy. You have a huge explosion in terms of the length, breadth of rural roads, water, electricity. You can go down the line, right? And these changes are palpable. And that is what I think gives a lot of people hope that, look, India can enjoy the kind of transformative growth that China did in this period that you're talking about. The glass half empty side, I think, has two components, okay? One is economic and one is political. The economic component is India has done a much better job building out the hardware of its economy than its software. What do I mean by software? Software refers to things like the rule of law, to policy certainty, to regulatory autonomy. Basically, people don't want to invest and then find midstream that the rules have changed, right? And we see a lot of that in India, whether it's on taxation, whether it's on e-commerce, whether it's on foreign direct investment. And the list goes on and on and on. The second part of the answer really is about politics, where we are seeing a much more muscular, nationalistic government that is a Hindu-first government, right? They believe that India, if you look at it demographically, is 80% Hindu, and therefore people who live in India should more or less abide by a package of Hindu kind of social and cultural tenets. Now, you might say, well, that makes sense. It's 80% of the population. But don't forget that 20%, we're talking about hundreds of millions of people because the overall population is 1.4 billion people. Not least, around 14% are Muslim. You know, India's Muslims are probably the world's single largest minority group, right? And so if you upset that delicate balance of democracy and diversity, I think that could, over the long run, have negative economic impacts.
I was going to wait to get to Prime Minister Modi and the BJP, but we should go there now since you just raised it. I have to confess that as a Westerner, I cannot understand Modi. He clearly is an extremely successful politician. He's been in office for a long time. Looks like he has a long time left. He seems to dominate not only a very large country, but one that has a history of fractious politics, to put it mildly. And as you've just said, has done remarkable things during his time as leader. How should we think about Modi as a religious nationalist who is a Hindu president, or as a modernizing leader who is taking India from whatever century he found it in and pulling it into the 21st century?
Well, I mean, the unsatisfactory answer, Alan, is both, right? Let's start with the BJP, the ruling party. I don't think we in the West have a very good vocabulary for understanding the BJP because the BJP doesn't look like a conventional political party in the sense that you look at the Republican Party or the Christian Democrats or the Labour Party in the UK.
The Republicans may be the bad comparison. So, but your point is well taken.
If you think about the universe, for instance, of center-right, roughly speaking, parties, right, in which the BJP, you could argue, fits in, it is a political wing of a larger social movement. Okay, this social movement is comprised of more than 36 organizations, ranging from a volunteer corps to a students' union, to a labor union, to a women's wing, to an agriculturalist movement. And the BJP is its political expression, which means that it derives quite a lot of power from civil society. It is a cadre-based party in every sense of the word. And what unifies all of these disparate organizations is a commitment to Hindutva, or Hinduness, right? This idea that, to put it very simply for your listeners, Indian culture and Hindu culture are coterminous, right? They should be one and the same thing. Narendra Modi comes from this movement, right? He cut his teeth as a schoolboy, basically, learning this doctrine and then spreading it amongst the masses, right? And worked his way up, much like you would, if you're a minor league baseball player, you work your way up to the big leagues. Well, the BJP, the political expression of this movement, is the big leagues here. So he is a true believer in this ideology. There's no question about that. At the same time, he has proven himself to be a very effective administrator. He was the chief minister, again, equivalent to our governor in the United States, of the state of Gujarat for more than a dozen years. And it's worth noting that this state, which is, a mid-sized state by Indian standards, was had the fastest growing GDP growth rates of any state during the time that Modi was the chief minister. Now, Gujarat has had a rich legacy of growth and investment, but Modi took that growth and he increased it even further. So his claim to fame when campaigning for prime minister in 2014 was, "You've seen what I've been able to do in Gujarat. Let me do that for the country." Now, in making that statement, again, there's two components to that. There is this more hardline a strain of Hindu nationalism, and there's this belief that India has to become a modernizing country that can be not just an economic powerhouse, but that can be a global geopolitical powerhouse, right? So Modi talks about India being a balancing power for generations. He says, no, under my rule, India should become a leading power.
He's also somehow presided over a period of, I don't want to call it tranquility, but of a dramatic reduction in institutional violence, something you've written about in some of your work. And clearly, India's backstory is a violent backstory. Certainly from partition on, it's pretty nasty in the late 20th century. And there's still outbursts. We had recently in Northeast India some violence communal violence, all sorts of background to that story that's not particularly relevant to this conversation. Again, is it Modi? Is it the BJP? Is it something else going on that has led to this reduction, at least, of violence, which is so important to success both in politics and in economics?
Well, I think these are trends that predate Modi, and Modi has continued them. It's worth pointing out that India is still a very young country. It's celebrating its 75th anniversary. So if you go back and look at the European or American state building projects, these too were very messy, chaotic, and quite violent at times, right? So in some sense, India isn't all that different. It's just that it's doing so, it's playing out before our eyes in the 21st century. What we have seen, and the data are pretty clear on this over the past 2 decades, is a sustained decline in collective violence. And by that, I mean terrorism, insurgency, communal riots, even kind of student protests, homicides, public displays of violence. That is, I think, due to many factors. One is a consolidation of the state and the really overwhelming growth in the security apparatus, right? I mean, if you look, for instance, at the growth in Indian paramilitary and police forces, I mean, it's been exponential over the past 2 decades. The second is that a lot of this violence was produced by, again, as part of the state building process and nation building process, disputes over caste and hierarchy, disputes over secessionism and incorporation, disputes over class in some cases, right? And these are definitely not resolved. But there has been progress on moving these forms of disputes away from sort of extrajudicial processes and funneling them more into the kind of democratic mainstream of electoral politics, right? Modi has certainly continued to invest in the building up and the strengthening of India's security state. I think there's no doubt about that. But we also shouldn't lose sight of the fact that, other forms of violence do appear to be on the rise. Lynchings, for instance, right? We've seen a spate of mobs, largely organized by Hindus, lynching Muslim men for doing things like allegedly seducing Hindu women and trying to convert them, or for illegally transporting cattle, which in some states is something that's against the law. So there is a deep sense amongst the Muslim minority community of sort of anxiety. And it's expressed through some of these public spectacles. A lot of that violence is performative, so it's not necessary. It's like terrorism, right? It's meant to kind of create a theatrical performance and to instill fear into people, not necessarily exact the highest number of lives.
Let's stay with Modi for a moment. How critical is he to this essentially positive dynamic that you're describing? Obviously, there's a long way to go before India gets to where it's going, but is he critical, or is he the agent of the moment?
Well, I think he is critical in the following sense, which is he has a really tremendous amount of public support. To the extent that we can measure this, there's a poll from Morning Consult which ranks global leaders based on domestic public opinion, and Modi's favorability is literally off the charts. It's at about 75%, according to this poll. Now, that's one poll you should take with a grain of salt. But the fact is that he did the unthinkable in 2014, which was to lead his party to a single party majority in parliament, a feat which had not been achieved in 3 decades since Indira Gandhi did it quite a long time ago. And not only did he do it in 2014, he repeated with a larger mandate in 2019, right? So that alone is remarkable. He, the way I like to frame it, has the oratorical skills of a Barack Obama and the retail political instinct of a Bill Clinton, right? And it's very rare for a politician to be equally good at both things. And Modi is one of those people. So there is a big question mark about the sustainability of some of these gains, because if Modi were to exit from the scene, would there be a leader, say in the BJP or elsewhere, that would be able to take this on? But there's no question that he has brought a new energy, a new kind of authority, but also a new concentration of power, right? Which has pros and cons. You're able to get stuff done, but you also are able to circumvent or short circuit a lot of democratic safeguards as well, right? So there are trade-offs here.
If you feel that the world lacks global leaders, please help support the Thalberg Foundation programs. Individual donations are being accepted at thalbergfoundation.org /donate. That's TALLBERG foundation.org /donate.
Let's use that to segue to the climate question. There are incredibly scary forecasts out there about large swaths of India becoming more or less uninhabitable because of a combination of excess heat and humidity. within a few years. This is not 100. This is not the 2100 stuff. It is the 2030, 2040 stuff. Today, India is the third largest CO2 emitter by volume and has committed to net zero only by 2070, which in practical terms, I would argue means opting out of at least the urgency around climate change, even while doubling down on strategies, understandable strategies, to bring hundreds of millions into modernity. How does that contradiction play out, do you think?
Well, I think we have to also give credit where credit is due, right? In the sense that India has, over the past 10 years or so, affected a dramatic increase in renewable energy at home. And it's on track to meet, if not potentially best, its so-called NDCs, or nationally determined contributions, that it set for itself in accordance with the Paris Climate Accords, right? And so if you look at solar capacity, if you look at wind, if you look at the investment in renewals, that we're seeing historic surges in all of those things. Now, it's true that coal continues to be the single biggest source of energy. It's about 55% of nationwide energy consumption, which is roughly the same proportion it was in the mid-1970s. And so, while India is doing quite a lot on the home front, I think, skeptics would point out that, look, its stated goals under the Paris Climate Pact are relatively modest. They're not really ambitious enough to deliver its fair share of emissions cuts. And so I do think that there is mounting pressure externally, but also, frankly, internally from, domestic civil society, from think tanks and academics. I think the one shortcoming here, and this is, not unique to India, is that it's not yet the basis of popular political mobilization. Anybody who has gone to Delhi recently will remark at just how awfully polluted it is, particularly during the winter months, right? I mean, politicians in Delhi themselves have called this a kind of, walking gas chamber. Yet this does not seem to move the needle very much when it comes to electoral politics. I think part of that is just a function of where India is on the socioeconomic spectrum, right? I mean, people are still fighting and agitating for, basic social safety nets, a livable wage, a job in the formal sector. And so right now, I think for many people, these are seen as would be good to have, but not necessarily vital. But we know that whether it is health, sanitation, life expectancy, economic productivity, these are all things that are being hurt by this increasingly warm and very volatile climate.
Then there's the Ministry of the Future scenario, Kim Robinson's book, where, as you know, he posits a mass death event in India. 25 million people die in his dystopian future. And that leads India essentially to dropping out of global arrangements and saying, we're just going to focus on our own issues because you refuse to do what needs to be done. India's, and this is the half-empty glass part of our conversation, India still has per capita income of only $2,400. It has a population it has a population that is slowing in its growth, but still expands. It's got all the positives and negatives of the law of large numbers. Those billion for whatever the number finally tops out as, live in a carbon-based economy, so they're by definition going to increase their emissions over time.
Well, I mean, I think, it's potentially, catastrophic, obviously. When I landed up in India for the first time after the COVID-19 pandemic, I came on a day when it was 49 degrees Celsius, which is about 120 Fahrenheit. And, there were stories in the paper of, the literally the pavement melting, right? Really dramatic sort of scenes. And, in a place like Delhi, which is used to pretty obscene levels of heat, Even her, sturdy Delhiites were up in arms about this. I think one of the things that India is mulling right now, and this has come out in a government ministry report, is that it is considering a plan to stop building new coal-fired plants across India, and this would affect things that have not already broken ground. So those beyond the kind of shovel ready. And this is a draft policy. It hasn't been approved by the federal cabinet, but it would signify, I think, a real uptick in how aggressive India wants to be to essentially take on this question. I think it would, also then put some of the onus on China, which is one of the only major nations, if not the only, still openly adding kind of new coal-fired power plants, right? Now, there's huge questions about what this is going to mean to India's industrial states, which are huge contributors to the economy. How are they going to produce the kind of electricity they need to just simply keep the lights on? But I do think that we are starting to see an increase in the ambition, but also, coming back to India's G20 leadership this year, a rising tide of anger at the developed world for not living up to their stated commitments on green finance, on funds for climate adaptation, and so on and so forth. And so, as we look out to that September summit, I expect this to be a key agenda item for India. And in this, they have been rallying quite a lot of support amongst the global South, right? India now has exercised, I think, a really interesting role in the global South. Of course, this is a broad category. You can hardly claim that everybody's on the same page, but I think that they are willing to up the ante now and feel like they actually have the leverage to do so. They have the leverage to do so. Why? Because many countries like the United States and the West are focused on the China challenge. And in focusing on the China challenge, India becomes absolutely central. And so if you see the new swagger with which Indian diplomats seem to be strutting around, this is part of the reason why.
Let's talk about that. The Prime Minister has recently been invited to Washington for a grand event. Apparently, it's supposed to be a good old-fashioned kind of state visit with all of the ruffles and flourishes. As you've just said, a lot of people in Europe and in particular the United States look to India as the possible replacement, I have air quotes on that word, for China. Somehow, as they think about the global, how global political arrangements are made, India's in favor, China's out of favor. It's all a silly reframing of how the world works, but it's the reframing of the moment. How do you think about the rivalry between India and China with regard to the global South, with regard to global leadership?
India certainly would like to see a much more multipolar setup, right? A polycentric setup is the term of art. But we have to keep in mind that India still has a number of deficiencies when it comes to becoming a clear peer competitor of China. You mentioned, for instance, the discrepancy in per capita income. That's certainly one. Secondly, is even when it comes to kind of, the ability to project power abroad, right? India still faces huge shortcomings in terms of arming its military, of sustaining its military, of being able to move its units, across great distances. That is one reason it has been leaning on the United States and engaging more intensely than ever, I think, with the Pentagon. And it is also a country that, let's not forget, is a democracy. And, people often talk about the democracy tax, right? That because you have to bring everybody along, that can kind of put a ceiling on how fast you can grow and what you can do, because you have to negotiate civil society, you have to negotiate subnational states, you have to negotiate an independent judiciary, and so on and so forth. And I think to some extent that is true. I would argue that that's a trade-off that's worth making, right? And it's something that eventually, in the Chinese case, obviously, all kinds of possibilities of political instability because of the way China governs itself. And so I think India has great power ambitions. There's no doubt about that. But whether it is on trade and its inability to really penetrate global supply chains, whether it's on the brass tacks of its kind of defense industrial complex, whether it's on the economy, all three of these fronts, it has quite a long ways to go. Now, you could argue that it's moving in the right direction, right? But I think many backers of India, frankly, many friends of India, would argue that the pace of change is not fast enough.
China clearly has ambition to write the new rules of global engagement, whether that involves projecting military power, economic power. I hesitate to use the word moral power. Clearly, that's what China wants. India, however, although it does want to be a great power and has the potential to be a great power, doesn't seem to have that same mission for itself to write the rules of how the world works, or does it?
Well, I think historically it has not. We have to remember that this was a country that had such grave domestic developmental needs at the time of independence, right? That many of India's post-independence leaders were really focused on getting their own house in order, right? How to raise people out of abject poverty, how to deal with these rigid inequalities, how to keep this fractious country with unprecedented diversity of religion, of caste, of language, and so on and so forth together. And I would say over the past couple of decades, there's been a realization that India has a much greater role to play on the global stage. And when it comes to Mr. Modi himself, would argue that what he is seeking, is not really creating something new, but rather revitalizing something of old, which was India, was a world power at one point. And as he describes it, these are his words, it had to suffer through 12 centuries of slavery, right, at the hands of all kinds of foreign invaders, not least the British Raj most recently. And so what he is trying to harken back to is this idea of India as a civilizational state that has a global presence, right? But this is a relatively kind of new shift in ambition. And we have to remember that in many key global fora, just take the UN Security Council for one, India is really not present, right? India has been agitating for a long time to be given a greater role at, say, the international financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, right? And the West has jealously, guarded their role in these institutions. So India and China both have issues with the current quote unquote liberal international order, perhaps for different reasons. But it's not as if India is clearly on the side of the U.S. and the West on all of these issues, because they actually feel badly done by in many of these instances.
Which is understandable. Let's end with this. You wrote recently, India may be touted as the next big thing, but as with any marketing campaign, one would be well advised to read the fine print.
That's true. I wrote that in Foreign Affairs as part of a book review of a new book, a very pessimistic new book on India called India is Broken by the Princeton economist Ashoka Modi. So what do I mean by that? What are the headlines? The headlines are India is experiencing a geopolitical sweet spot. It is the fastest growing major economy in the world. It has recently surpassed China as the world's most populous country. Despite its ambivalence about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it is still feted and courted by all major powers, including Western powers. We are seeing signs that global companies like Apple and Foxconn and others are looking to India as they offshore from China, right? So I think this confluence of events has led many people to think this is India's moment. But, you scratch the surface and there are many questions, right, when you get to the fine print. Take the economy. India still produces far few jobs to employ the million people who are joining the labor force every month and will continue to do so for the next several decades, right? It is a country that has moved from agriculture to services, virtually skipping over manufacturing, right? That is a unique trajectory for almost any, major economy. Politically, it has a guarantee of stability in the short term. We agree about that. But again, these kinds of social divisions that the current government is also stoking, particularly between Hindus and Muslims, could have all kinds of nasty unintended consequences. On foreign policy, there's no doubt that over the past 3 decades, India has moved into a closer embrace with the West and an alignment or a strategic convergence with the United States. But as the Russia-Ukraine example shows, right, it is not an ally in that sense, right? There is a convergence, not necessarily a congruence, as my colleague Ashley Tellis likes to put it. I think we have to be careful when we read these hyped up headlines to really pause and say, like, okay, these seem to be positive changes, but what are the details of how this is working out, and what are the steps India has yet to take in order to fulfill its potential, both at home as well as a power abroad.
Now you've got me worried about what headline I can use on our podcast. But it's a good problem to have. Thank you very much for the conversation and for your insights.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. Please rate our show on Apple Podcast and subscribe. Meanwhile, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Or you can subscribe to our newsletter at tallbergfoundation.org to learn more about our work. That's TALLBERG foundation.org. Thank you, and we'll be back again next week for another episode of Tallberg's New Thinking for a New World. This podcast was brought to you through the generous support of SNF, the Stavros Niarchos Foundation.